Hello, welcome to Moving Forward Together with Equal Justice Needham. I am the show host, Massiel Gallardo. In today's show, we will consider the history of housing discrimination that led to racial segregation nationally and right here in Needham. Today, we have with us two expert guests on the topic. Welcome, hello. Bob Van Meter, a policy expert who leads monthly presentations for community groups on the causes of racial segregation that draws on the book The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Bob has 25 years of experience leading community development projects that advance racial and economic justice in the Boston area. Welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. Gloria Greis, Executive Director of the Needham Historical Center. Dr. Greis writes extensively on the general history of Needham and has recently been exploring the history of discrimination in our town. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. So let's jump right into the history of housing discrimination. Bob, in your presentations with community groups that you discuss the causes of racial segregation, how or why would you like to talk to us about how or why did you put together the presentations?
The reasons for putting it together were, for me, years and years of experience advocating for affordable housing, both professionally mostly in Boston, but also as a volunteer in my home community of Acton, which I'm sure faces many of the same challenges as Needham does, and finding increasing concerns about racial justice over the last decade, but very few people, in my experience, connect racial justice issues to inclusive housing policies and the need for more inclusive housing policies in suburban communities, and kind of a recognition that we need more voices for inclusive housing policies in all of the suburbs of Boston, and in fact all over the country. And then the revelatory experience of reading in early 2017 the book that came out, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, and finding that even though I'd been involved in affordable housing issues for decades, Mr. Rothstein put the story together in a new way that made it come alive for me, and I thought would for many other people as well.
Okay, thank you for sharing. In your presentations, you talk about the 6 pillars of segregation: zoning, restrictive covenants, discriminatory real estate practices, redlining, urban renewal, and highway construction and violence. Would you care to elaborate? And Gloria, feel free to jump in to share your insights about the local conditions.
Okay.
Sure. The story that I'm trying to tell is a story that is more than 100 years old, and really begins at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, as the Great Migration was beginning of African American people to northern cities and towns, and at the same time the Jim Crow system of kind of maintaining white supremacy in the South was kind of becoming formalized and getting a legal structure. And as that was occurring, the Jim Crow ideology was migrating north, and white people in the North were looking for ways to separate African Americans from their communities, and that began to some degree with zoning. Zoning didn't really exist in this country in the 19th century. It began mostly in the early 20th century, and it began at the same time as racial segregation was seen as a need and a positive good by leaders of many cities and many communities. And In fact, in many of the cities of the border states, places like Baltimore, Louisville, Kentucky, St. Louis, Missouri, those places enacted zoning laws that explicitly excluded African Americans from neighborhoods where white people lived and tried to force African Americans to live in designated areas. So that was the first round of segregation under zoning. That way to separate the races, which in many ways was similar to the apartheid regime in South Africa, where blacks were separated from whites, etc. That was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1917. So the people that were fighting for zoning laws sought another way to exclude African Americans. And the thing that they came up with was single-family zoning and banning of multifamily housing in single-family districts. And so that's the beginning of the story. And most communities in the United States adopted zoning sometime between 1910 and 1950. Some didn't really have zoning until the 1950s. And I'm sure that Dr. Greis can talk about when zoning was adopted here in Needham.
Interestingly, real estate restrictions become not prevalent, but present in Needham, starting around the 1870s. In 1853, the train through the center comes through, as we know it, and that brings a lot more real estate development into the Great Plain, which at that time was open pasture and not very densely occupied. The house lots are actually being bought up by local merchants. It's not outside real estate interests. It's local merchants seeing this opportunity. The money is their own, and they're recouping it or trying to recoup it from the sale of the property. At the same time, the Needham Bank is founded, and they see an opportunity to provide financing for this new development of real estate. So they see this as a way of drawing money in from clients, and if they stabilize this mortgage market, they're getting money from clients with the interest rates. The developers are getting the development money. It's no longer their own money. They're borrowing the money. So that investment is safer. And by putting the bank behind it, individual buyers are reassured, because this is really the sort of the beginning of house buying. And you see the beginning of restrictions. So it starts out as a way of reassuring buyers in order to stabilize this mortgage system, becomes a way of boxing out certain people. And for a long time in Needham, that was not African Americans so much as it was Catholics and Jews, immigrants from Italy, from Poland, from Russia. Zoning law in Needham itself dates to 1923. And that does establish single family housing over the majority of the town's property. And then, of course, the federal government gets into the act in the 30s with the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and then ultimately the GI Bill and all of these other mortgage mechanisms.
And because these segregation laws were in effect or started in the 1920s through 1970s, one may assume that this is part of history that no longer has an effect today. But what can you say about the effects of segregation and the effects on the wealth gap today?
It's a huge effect.
Yeah, it's a huge effect. So the kind of suburban home ownership boom of the late 1940s, 50s, and 60s was, in the words of Brandeis sociologist Dr. Tom Shapiro and his co-author, the largest mass wealth creation event in American history. and African Americans were excluded from that wealth creation event. Hispanic citizens were by and large excluded as well, although not quite as rigidly, probably. And that means that has in large measure produced the racial wealth gap that I think many people today are familiar with, and as I'm sure you are, and has been documented both here in the Boston region by the Federal Reserve Bank's 2015 study, The Color of Wealth, as well as by many other studies over the last couple of decades around the country.
It's not only the creation of wealth, but the intergenerational passing of wealth.
Right.
So as each generation passes, generations who are excluded from this real estate boom fall farther and farther behind in relative terms. With the advent of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and this is where maps of greater suburban areas were graded by color. Green and blue were the best. That's where the mortgagers, that's where they're safe investments. They should aim their mortgages for those. Yellow was declining, and by that it meant they were starting to see the infiltration of less desirable populations, which would vary by region. So in Greater Boston, for example, the less desirable populations were Eastern Europeans, Asians very often, not so many African Americans. In other parts of the country, it would be African American. So it was actually surprisingly fine grained. And then the red areas were the areas in which they were advised not to write mortgages, and that's the origins of the term redlining. These were the red areas were the areas in which they were deemed undesirable, hazardous for loan provision, and these would be the areas in which, in Needham, the immigrant populations were guided to. The real estate, and in Needham, this is Needham Heights, and the real estate values in Needham Heights were always much lower. For decades, a house in Needham Heights was worth less relative to a house in other parts of Needham, and that gap just increases over the generations. And that was federal policy.
And
Thank you.
And the zoning restrictions, which went into place starting in the 1920s, remain.
Yeah.
And that functions in many respects, as researcher Amy Dane has called it, as a paper wall of zoning that keeps people with fewer assets out of many, many suburban communities. It keeps people out because it's very difficult to build multifamily housing in many, many greater Boston communities. And without multifamily housing, you have very little rental housing, you have very little affordability. So you have people of color, not all of them certainly, but many of them excluded from communities that have the best schools, the best access to many other amenities, and that exclusive zoning is still a fact for nearly all of Greater Boston's suburban communities, and is one of the things that maintains the segregation that was created in the first half of the 20th century.
And would it be fair to say that I'm thinking of the zoning, how it affects by race or by minorities, but
Yep.
I'm also thinking about by profession. I'm thinking
Yes.
in the case of Needham teachers
Right.
who would want for their kids to attend the Needham schools but cannot
Right.
afford to live here. Our servicemen from the police and fire department who may want to live in the communities that they serve but they can't afford it. Would that be because of the zoning? Is that what zoning has led to in communities like Needham?
Yes. I mean, I think there's lots of nuance to that answer, but in general, I would say zoning restrictions mean that it's very difficult to build multifamily housing of any kind, whether it be condominiums or rentals. You can, depending on where the community is on the 40B thresholds, you can build some housing that has 25% affordability, but if communities erect lots of hurdles to even 40B developments are hard to build, and I think that's true, all over the greater Boston area.
And also the limitation of,
Yeah.
single-family zoning limits the amount of available land.
Right.
Which means when a plot becomes available, it goes to the highest bidder, and that's a ceiling that is yet to be reached. Zoning, I guess like restrictions, zoning is a tool that has its advantage, it has its good uses. It is a way that a municipality can manage growth, not population demographic growth, but infrastructure, school building, and that sort of thing. And also, once you buy a single family house, that's your repository of wealth. And then to say, well, your neighbor can just build a 10-story building next door to you, does impact your value, but that does not exempt a community for looking for opportunities that fit for both homeowners, current homeowners, and future growth. There are places in Needham where you could build much greater density, good access to transportation, so for people who need to commute, and are not in anybody's backyard in that sense. So there were opportunities, but with the way the American political economy works, we've made people invest their resource. People who own a home, that's their reserve, that's their well of savings. You destabilize one, then you can't. You have to find some balance where you're providing necessary housing and necessary housing equity.
What do you think, Bob, about the
Bob's
advantages?
not agreeing with me.
I don't totally agree. I do think single-family zoning is in its essence an exclusionary thing, and you certainly don't necessarily want to build a 10-story building in a what is now a single-family area, but it would be great if you could build a fourplex or certainly a duplex. And I think single-family zoning grew in the 1920s, and Rothstein's book includes a quote from a Columbia Law School professor, I believe his name was Ernest Freund, who said that the coming of single-family zoning has been driven by fears of African American people. And that's true even in places where there were few African Americans living in the first half of the 20th century. Boston area had fewer than some areas, but there were historic African American communities near the railroad in Newton that was destroyed by the building of the Mass Turnpike extension during the 1960s. There were African American communities, and racially restrictive covenants did restrict African Americans, even when most of the people who might be moving in were Italian immigrants or Jewish immigrants. But to come back to the zoning question and how you deal with that, I do think that communities need tools to plan, and that planning is a way that communities have control over land use, and zoning is part of that. One of the problems that we have in the region is that we have far too many jurisdictions deciding on their own what they are going to be willing to do. And when we have a regional economy and we have people who want to live in places who are restricted by the people who live there now, I also have a different view than Gloria about homes as wealth. Yes, they are wealth. Yes, they have been wealth for the last 70 years, but they weren't necessarily that prior to World War II in the same way.
No.
And there's kind of a political, if you will, a way that local politics has been perverted by what some people call home voters. So people whose decisions about how they vote and who they vote for on local issues is completely tied up in their perspective about what's going to affect their home value. And the question of whether home values are impacted by people of different races living there. I mean, that is also, I guess, a subject of scholarly contention right now, and how that whole idea was promoted by the real estate industry starting in the 1910s.
That whole notion of your house as your investment, your growth
Yep.
investment, may really be as recent as the 80s.
Right.
We were living in Cambridge at the time, and we had a condo that had sort of this, well, and all of a sudden we started getting these things from realtors, sell to us, sell to us, sell to us, and the value of it just did this. And this was like your home was no longer a home, your home was an asset.
Did real estate companies in Needham actively discriminate?
Yes. The trouble with, we actually do have some deeds that have explicit restrictions on, you may not, this house, the buyer agrees that this house will never be sold to a Negro. But unfortunately, and one of the reasons this is such a pervasive problem is that it's the thing that's left unsaid. It's the gentleman's agreement. I mean, I don't say that because, I'm of Italian background. Realtor's not going to say, I'm only going to show you houses in the Heights. They're going to say, I think this house is what you're looking for. I'm not seeing, there are no houses for sale in this part of town, or the houses in this part of town are not what you want. Mm-hmm. You asked for this, but this house doesn't have it. So they're not saying, I'm not going to sell you this house. They're not saying, because of who you are, because of what you are, you're going to be shoehorned into this neighborhood. They're not even saying, wouldn't you be happier living near other Italians who speak your language? They're saying, this is what's available. Oh, you're going to love this house. This house is exactly what you're looking for. So it's not always as overt as saying, here's our policy. Mm-hmm. It's just
subliminal.
It's subliminal. It's understood. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes it so hard, because it's not actionable.
Well, it's usually not actionable unless you can do testing.
Yeah.
The Long Island newspaper Newsday did a wonderful investigative report in 2019. And the difference between New York and Massachusetts is that in New York, if one party consents to taping, video or audio taping of an interaction, it's legal. And so they sent their investigators to do testing in Long Island real estate agencies. And they not only published a wonderful multi-part series in the newspaper, they also had an interactive website and a documentary, essentially, that I use with my students to show how real estate discrimination works today. And you have two people who present themselves to the same real estate agent with equal financial condition and similar age, and both looking for homes in a certain price range. And one of them is white and the other is African American, and they are treated completely differently. The white woman in this case is given a number of listings, and the realtor takes her to see a couple of homes. The African American woman is given no listings, is told that she needs to have a pre-qualification before the realtor will show her anything, and if you were the African American woman and you did not see the videotape of the other tester, you would not know that you had been treated differently. And that is the case why it is very difficult to detect the kind of racial steering that Gloria was describing. It's only detectable if you have trained testers to detect it.
To identify
Or
it.
And it's expensive to do that,
Yeah.
actually.
Well, there's the recent case that the Globe published,
Right.
where an African American couple wanted to sell their house, so they got an appraisal,
Right.
and the wife said, "That doesn't sound right."
Yeah.
So she went through the house and she removed everything that said African. She took away the family picture.
Right.
She took away anything that showed, African culture, and she asked a couple friends of hers, white friends,
Yeah.
to pretend to be owners of the house. Their valuation was almost $500,000 higher, and that's not chump change. They're not
Right.
saying a $10,000-$20,000 difference. You could see as sort of maybe the opinion of the appraiser. $500,000 because the house was believed to be owned by a white couple and not by a black couple. So
I wish
If
we
they
had
hadn't
more
done that.
time. This is just a topic of conversation that deserves much more time. I wish we had it. Also for me to express some of my personal experiences in Needham and housing.
Right.
So I guess, just a side note to our producers to maybe continue this conversation for a second visit. I want to thank both of you for your time and for being here. This was great information that certainly helped me. And I hope that it helped our viewers who are listening about the history of housing discrimination nationally and in Needham. Thank you for being here.
Thank you
To our
for having us.
viewers, we want to invite you to fill out a poll on our website, EJN website, and about what was discussed today. If you have any comments or suggestions, we also invite you to email us at needham@gmail.com. Thank you for being here. Thank you, everybody watching us. Until next time.